Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready to dive into something that's a total game changer in commercial real estate? We're talking triple net leases today. Now, I know, lease structures might not sound like the most riveting thing, but stick with me. This is like level up knowledge, whether you're knee deep in commercial real estate or just dipping your toes in. And to make sure we break it all down clearly, we've got an expert with us.
Glad to be here. Triple net leases, definitely a mouthful, but once you get them, they can be powerful tools.
Love it. And full transparency, we're using some great insights from Allies Commercial Realty, a top-notch commercial real estate brokerage. They know their stuff. So let's start simple. What even is a triple net lease? It's not like the lease you'd have on an apartment, right?
Nope, not quite. With a typical residential lease, you pay your rent, and the landlord usually covers most of the building expenses, right? A triple net lease, sometimes called an NNN lease, flips that script. The tenant's on the hook for not just the base rent, but also their portion of three big expenses: property taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance, usually just called CAM.
So instead of just rent, it's like you're paying your share of the building upkeep directly.
Exactly. And usually how much of those expenses you cover depends on how much space you're renting. Got a bigger space, you're probably shouldering a bigger chunk of the cost.
Makes sense. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Now, I saw that Allies Commercial Realty mentioned a few different types of commercial leases. How do those compare to the triple net lease?
Think of it like choosing a vacation. You've got your all-inclusive resorts, super easy, right? And then you've got those where you book everything yourself, more control, but more to handle. A full-service lease is like that all-inclusive resort, one price, your rent, and pretty much everything's covered. But that triple net lease, that's more like booking an Airbnb. You've got more control, but you're also handling stuff like cleaning fees, which in this case would be those extra expenses we talked about.
So more hands-on with the triple net, but also potentially more say in things.
Yeah.
And then there's that other type, the modified gross lease, right? Where does that one fit in?
The in-between. The modified gross lease is like a vacation package deal. Some things are included and some you pick and choose. The landlord and the tenant share some of those operating expenses, so it's a bit more balanced.
Finding that middle ground. So it's all about figuring out your comfort zone with risk and what's important to you. Speaking of what's important, Allies Commercial Realty had a really helpful example of how a triple net lease works using real numbers. They use a scenario where a company rents 25,000 square feet of space at a base rent of $8.25 per square foot. And then, of course, you've got those NNN expenses on top of that. $600 for property tax, $1,400 for insurance, and $1,240 for CAM. So to get the total rent, you just add those NNN costs to that base rent.
You got it. In this case, your base rent would be $206,250. That's just the 25,000 square feet times that $8.25 base rent. Then add in those triple net expenses, the $600, $1,400, and $1,240. That brings your total yearly rent to $209,490. Monthly, you're looking at a hefty $17,457.50.
Wow, those costs definitely add up. You mentioned CAM earlier, and I realized I don't actually know what all goes into those costs.
Super important point. Transparency is key with these triple net leases. Tenants always ask for a detailed breakdown of every cost category, especially CAM. For example, what about landscaping? Is that included in CAM? Snow removal? Security? Knowing how those costs are calculated is crucial.
Because those things can change, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't a really bad winter with tons of snow mean a way higher CAM cost because of all that snow removal?
You got it. And on top of that, property taxes could go up, insurance premiums could change, maintenance costs can be unpredictable.
So it's not as simple as seeing the base rent and calling it a day, is it?
Yeah.
Tenants really need to do their homework with a triple net lease.
Absolutely. But there's a flip side. Allies Commercial Realty pointed out that these leases can actually be good for both the landlord and the tenant.
They talked about predictable income for landlords, which makes sense since the tenant's covering most of those fluctuating expenses. But for tenants, they highlighted tenant control, which seems a little counterintuitive at first.
It's all about perspective. Tenants take on more responsibility with the triple net lease, for sure, but they also get more autonomy. It's about having more of a say in how those expenses are managed.
So instead of the landlord just picking whoever for landscaping, for example, the tenant might be able to find someone more affordable.
Exactly. Or maybe they decide to invest in energy-efficient upgrades that'll save them money on utilities over time.
A trade-off.
Yeah.
More responsibility for the chance to save some money and have more control. That's a really interesting dynamic. Now, we talked about predictable income being a plus for landlords, but are there any details they should keep in mind from a long-term investment perspective? Allies Commercial Realty didn't go into too much depth on that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's different, thinking about residential versus commercial real estate investing. With residential properties, people are often hoping the value goes way up over time, right? Appreciation, they call it. But with a triple net lease on a commercial property, it's more about that steady cash flow.
So less about hoping the property value skyrockets and more about having that consistent, predictable income coming in.
Exactly. And for some investors, that's super appealing. They want that stability, that lower risk.
That's huge. But what about those rent escalations that Allies Commercial Realty mentioned? How do those fit into that long-term picture?
Rent escalations are pretty standard with triple net leases. They're usually set up to keep pace with inflation or increases in property taxes, things like that. So, for example, let's say you have a rent escalation clause of 3% per year. Doesn't sound like much, right? But over a 5-year lease, that could mean a pretty significant increase in rental income for the landlord.
A way to stay ahead of rising costs, basically. But for tenants, it's something to keep in mind for long-term budgeting.
Absolutely. Both sides have to factor those potential increases in.
Makes sense. Now, we've been talking a lot about landlords, but let's switch gears back to the tenant for a second. We talked about how having control over expenses is a good thing, but are there any downsides to being responsible for those costs that can change?
That's where things can get a little, unpredictable. We talked about those expenses, property taxes going up, insurance premiums changing, unexpected maintenance stuff. If a tenant isn't ready for that, it can really hurt.
Kind of like planning a road trip, right? You budget for gas, food, all that. But then, bam, car trouble. Suddenly you're digging into your emergency fund.
Exactly. And tenants in a triple net lease, they need that cushion, that emergency fund for those unexpected costs. If they don't, those variable expenses could really throw them off.
It's a balancing act then, isn't it? Weighing the potential cost savings and the control of a triple net lease against those risks. No one should jump into this without doing their research.
Couldn't agree more. That's exactly why Allies Commercial Realty was so big on reviewing those lease terms. This isn't a skim and sign kind of document. You have to understand what you're agreeing to.
And they even said it's a good idea to bring in a professional commercial real estate attorney to make sure everything's on the up and up.
Having that legal expert in your corner is so valuable, even for people who've done this before. Lease agreements, they're legally binding, and it's really easy to miss important details. An attorney who knows commercial real estate can make sure the agreement protects everyone involved.
Like having a guide in unfamiliar territory. They know where to step, what to look out for.
Exactly. They can help you avoid those potential problems. They can negotiate, make sure the terms are good for you, and hopefully prevent any big legal headaches later on. Totally worth it for the peace of mind.
It's not just about knowing what a triple net lease is then. It's about understanding why it matters and how it fits into the big picture.
You got it. Informed decisions, that's what we're talking about. Understanding how unique this type of agreement really is.
It's interesting, though. Allies Commercial Realty, they mostly focused on the financial side of triple net leases, which is obviously key. But this whole conversation, it makes you think bigger picture. What does this kind of lease structure mean for the relationship between a landlord and a tenant over the long term?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, on the one hand, you could see how a triple net lease could actually be good for the relationship, right?
How so?
Well, because it's all out in the open. Both sides know exactly what they're responsible for, so it can be more balanced, more fair.
Tenants like the control they get, and landlords like that predictable income, not having to deal with the day-to-day stuff as much.
Right, exactly. But, like with any partnership, there's always the potential for things to get, a little sticky.
What do you mean?
Well, let's say those triple net expenses go way up, or there's some disagreement about how to handle those costs. That could definitely cause some friction.
Like anytime you've got money involved, communication is key, right?
Wow.
Making sure everyone's on the same page about the risks and the rewards.
100%. You've got to be able to talk things through.
It's interesting. Allies Commercial Realty, they really stressed having that commercial real estate attorney involved. Why is that so important, even if you've got experience with commercial real estate?
Because even if you've done a few of these deals, it's so easy to miss something. These agreements, they're legally binding, and there's a lot of fine print. An attorney who really knows this stuff, they can help make sure everyone's protected.
Like having a guide to walk you through it all.
Exactly. They can spot potential problems, make sure you're getting good terms, and hopefully help you avoid any big legal headaches later on.
Smart. Allies Commercial Realty, they didn't really get into specifics on this, but are there any particular clauses in a triple net lease that tenants should watch out for?
Definitely. It always depends on the specific property and the tenant's business, but a couple of big ones come to mind. First off, those expense caps we talked about earlier. Super important for tenants to understand how those work.
Those limit how much the triple net expenses can increase each year.
Exactly. Let's say you negotiate a cap of, say, 2% on CAM increases. So if CAM costs are $10,000 one year, the most they can go up to the next year is $10,200, even if the actual costs are higher.
That's huge. So it's like a built-in safety net. What else?
Insurance is another big one. Landlords, they'll often require tenants to have certain levels of liability insurance, property insurance, that kind of thing.
Which makes sense. They want to protect their investment if something happens.
Right. Tenants need to really look at those requirements, make sure they've got the right coverage, and of course, factor those insurance costs into their budget.
All about knowing what you're getting into, right? Assessing that risk.
Exactly. And speaking of risk, we should definitely mention indemnity clauses. Those basically spell out who's responsible if there's damage to the property.
So like if a pipe bursts and floods the place, the indemnity clause would say who has to pay for the repairs.
Exactly. Tenants really need to be crystal clear on what they're potentially liable for under that indemnity clause and make sure their insurance covers those situations.
It really highlights why having that legal expert in your corner is so crucial.
No doubt. They can help you make sense of it all, get you better terms, and just make sure you're comfortable with everything before you sign on the dotted line.
It's been fascinating unpacking all this with you. I feel like we've gone from triple net to really getting a handle on how these leases work, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right? The more you understand this stuff, the better off you'll be.
Could not agree more. A huge thank you to our expert for breaking it all down for us, and to Allies Commercial Realty for those awesome insights. And of course, thank you to all of you for joining us for this deep dive into triple net leases. We'll be back soon to explore another corner of the real estate world. Until then, happy investing.
Get in touch with Allies Commercial Realty at info@alliescommercialrealty.com to find your ally in commercial real estate.